Let's start with why we're here today, talking about the big, beautiful bill. I know you want to talk about rural health impacts that this bill is going to have. Talk through your fears, kind of what you think this might mean for small communities like Petersburg, where they don't have a large hospital, but there's very important healthcare providers, or similar communities like that.
Sure. Well, you call it the big, beautiful bill, and Trump does. I call it the large, lousy law. And one of the reasons is that it cuts 12 million people directly off of Medicaid, and it's going to leave 17 million people uninsured, including more than 500,000 in Illinois. Why? Because they're cut off of Medicaid a bunch, and then a bunch of people don't get tax credits that Obamacare would otherwise provide to them. So when you have that many people who all of a sudden don't have a way of paying for their health care, then it hurts all those rural healthcare providers that depend on Medicaid as a form of payment for so many of their patients. And I would hazard to guess many of them are located here in central and southern Illinois, certainly in downstate Illinois. We expect that something like between 5 and 10 hospitals and healthcare systems are at risk of closure. And so today I'm here at this, this healthcare clinic that's an offshoot of Memorial to kind of explain the consequences of this bill and shine a light on it so that we can do everything we can to A, hold people accountable, and then B, try to reverse it hopefully in the next Congress.
A lot of the hospitals that seem to be affected by this could be on a closure list at some point in the future are in Republican congressional districts. How do you get those voters to understand the impacts that you think this bill is going to have?
I think it's by doing events like this that we basically kind of raise for their awareness what is actually going to happen with regard to their Medicaid. I'm also worried about Medicare because this large, lousy law is going to result in, according to the Congressional Budget Office, $3.3 trillion in additional debt. And the CBO has also indicated that because the deficit and debt are going up so much, it may trigger automatic cuts to Medicare. So we're talking about not only poor people who will be affected because of Medicaid cuts, we're also talking about seniors who could be affected by Medicare cuts. And so at the end of the day, however, everybody's going to be affected. Because if, God forbid, one of these hospitals in these areas in the rural parts of Illinois are closed, then everyone, regardless of how their health care is paid for, would be affected negatively.
Let's talk about the Senate race a little bit here. Tell me why you're the best candidate for this race. You're one of 3 very experienced politicians running for this seat. You risk losing your job if you don't win here in the primary or if you don't win the general election. Why go for it and decide to run for the Senate now?
Well, why go for it? It's a little bit about my personal story. I came to this country when I was 3 months old, and thanks to the generosity of the American people, when my father lost his income in the recession of 1973, we went into public housing and food stamps. So I'm a child of public housing and food stamps, and when my father was able to get back on his feet and then find a great job in, of all places, Peoria, Illinois, he basically instructed my brother and me every night at the dinner table, remember the greatness of this country, and whatever you do, make sure it's there for the next families who need it. That became my mission statement, my why. That is what has motivated me for 5 terms in Congress to do the work that we're doing. And now to be able to potentially pursue that mission statement in the U.S. Senate would give me the opportunity to potentially have a bigger impact and a deeper impact. As far as what differentiates my candidacy from the others, and I like my opponents, I think 2 things. One, I've made a career of standing up to bullies and bad actors. In Congress, I went after e-cigarette companies who preyed on our youth and tried to hook them onto vapes. As somebody just mentioned to me in the lobby of this healthcare clinic, they saw me in a documentary on Netflix being featured because of that work. I held them accountable and we got results. And I also went after food conglomerates that poisoned our baby food with toxic heavy metals. Again, we went after them, held them accountable, got results, and now I think we have to Similarly, hold our current government accountable, make sure that it stays within guardrails and that it does what the people want. So I have a track record of doing that, and I think that differentiates me from the others. Secondly, I think people want their U.S. senators and representatives to meet them where they are economically. They want them to help them, whether they're working poor, middle class, or growing a business, realize their American dream. That is, as I told you, my mission statement in life. How do I pass along the blessings conferred on my family? And so, again, as a former small business person and as somebody who's worked on these issues for almost a decade, it differentiates me from my opponents.
You've been consistently one of the top fundraisers in Congress. Every quarter, it seems like you're reporting some really big contribution numbers. How do you do that?
Look, I'm just blessed to have a lot of individual donors throughout Illinois and elsewhere who believe in my mission. I told you my mission is very clear. It's to make sure the American dream is accessible to others. And I think that people fundamentally want that mission to be achieved because they feel it's not something that is the number one priority of this administration. And so when I talk about it and my office does its good work, they see that this is something they should support. And so they do, as you can tell, with a lot of gusto.
Yeah, let's get into kind of that mission and the message. Democrats are obviously outnumbered in Congress right now, but there's some folks in the public who think your party's not doing enough to fight back against the Trump administration, fight back against congressional Republicans. Why are they wrong? Why should they vote for an incumbent Democrat for a Senate race?
I don't think they're wrong. I think they might be right, actually. Let's just take one particular case, which is the continuing resolution, which funded the federal government basically 3 or 4 months ago. I voted against that continuing resolution, and unfortunately, the Senate approved it. We can kind of go back and relitigate why that happened, but the point of the matter is we have to stand up for our priorities, our principles, but most importantly, we have to stand up for the Constitution and what makes America really exceptional. To me, it's the idea of equality of everybody having due process of law rights, and then having checks and balances so that there's no accumulation of power in any one place where our government can do things that would really run counter to our values.
How do you change that perception, though? I mean, the math is the math. The votes are what they are, especially on some of the recent legislation we've seen. How do you get it across that Democrats are doing enough, or maybe what more can you do if you're not doing enough?
Well, I think, first of all, going back to something we talked about before, I think we have to speak to the economic concerns of average voters, average Americans, people like my parents and others who feel that it's getting harder and harder to make ends meet, retire with dignity, educate their children, care for their children, buy a home, afford to live in most cities and towns in America. That is the number one thing that we should be talking about. Once we do that, I think that people will be less likely to tune us out when we talk about other issues of importance that we want them to also pay attention to. And I think that that's kind of what is helping to motivate my campaign, which is we got to get back to basics and we got to make sure that we attend to those economic concerns, because the most sensitive nerve in the body is the pocketbook nerve. And unless you kind of deal with that, they're not going to listen to you when you talk about, whether it's our concerns about democracy, our concerns about due process of law, and other issues, although those are of paramount concern as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's get into some of the policy areas. You're one of the authors of the bill to force the sale of TikTok, which is certainly a unique issue in the legislature, but it's one issue I think a lot of young voters are interested in. some view it as a ban. I know it's not a ban of TikTok, but speak to those young voters, I guess, who think that maybe you're going too far, you're touching something that doesn't need to be touched.
I want TikTok to survive. I want TikTok to flourish. However, I don't want it to be controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP does bad things with the data, with the algorithms, etc., that it gets access to. And so that's why that law received so much overwhelming bipartisan support, despite concerns in different quarters. I think that at the end of the day, a TikTok, which is operated by a non-CCP or non-adversarial controlled entity, will be much better for everybody. But more importantly, that's the law, and that's kind of the will of the people. We need to make sure that it happens. I'm concerned that the Trump administration has now, because of its tariff wars, the tariff chaos, now given an issue to the CCP to use as leverage in their negotiations. And unfortunately, what that means is that our national security has fallen prey to, this tariff war and the tariff chaos.
Speaking of national security, you're on the Intelligence Committee. Iran's been a big issue the last several weeks for your committee. Was the president right to strike Iran?
I don't think a military solution is sufficient to deal with the underlying issue, which is we must make sure Iran does not possess a nuclear weapon, okay? That can't happen. When they went ahead without any congressional consent, by the way, they created two problems. One, the American people in the past decided that consent is necessary, otherwise bad things happen and wars occur, endless wars occur, whether it's in Vietnam or the Middle East, and they don't want that to happen again. The second bad thing that happened is now that we did it, we can't account for hundreds of kilograms of enriched uranium. We can't account for centrifuges. We can't account for secret components or undeclared sites. And as a consequence, I'm concerned that they may potentially be in a situation where they're going to rush to a nuclear weapon, and we're not going to be aware of it because they're going to go so underground and they're going to have reason to eject the inspectors that we wouldn't even be able to catch it. So the solution here is get back to the table. Get back to the table, negotiate a peaceful end to this nuclear weapons program once and for all. That is why the Trump administration is eager to do so, by the way, because they know a military solution was not sufficient. They can only end it at the table.
Mm-hmm. That has been one of the big issues that you brought up about this whole strike, is not just was it the right thing to do, but the authority of Congress in this situation. President Trump's not the first president to do this. President Obama did it and angered some folks too without getting congressional approval for military action in Libya earlier in his presidency. How do you get the president, any president, not just this one, to go to Congress and seek approval from the legislature for these things?
Well, look, I think that the issue is this, which is that the executive branch has accumulated too much power, right? And it's happened over the years under Democratic and Republican administrations. I think after this presidency, hopefully maybe even during this presidency, we're going to have to embark on almost a post-Watergate style of reforms, which claw back power from the executive branch and put it back in the people's hands. Why do we want that? The reason is very simple. We've seen now with the tariff chaos, where he uses emergency powers to increase tariffs to 135% or 35% on Canadian products, that it creates tremendous economic problems for our working families. We've seen now with deploying American troops on U.S. soil against American citizens that creates tremendous anxiety among Americans. We've now seen bombing other countries without congressional consent, again, under emergency powers, creates all kinds of potential problems that we've got to curtail the use of these emergency powers, because that is not what the American people want or intend for their president to use. when there is no emergency, but they're just using the power to get around the will of the people, and then they get us into some quagmire, and bad things happen. That's the story of America, okay? When there's no accountability, bad things happen, and that's what we're seeing right now.
To wrap up here, you mentioned earlier that economic issues is something that the party needs to address to win over the trust of voters. You're not the only Democrat who's kind of said that. It's been a pretty consistent message, I think, for a lot of people in the party.
Say the first part again.
Economic message is very important to getting people to trust your party. How would Democrats actually deliver if you win control of Congress in 2026?
Well, one thing, if I'm privileged to be U.S. Senator, the one thing that I'm going to be pushing like no other. As a former small business person, I like to say I signed the front of the check and the back of the check. And one of the things that I know is certain for small and medium-sized companies throughout the state of Illinois, we don't have the skilled talent we need to fill the positions that exist today in order to propel our country forward. At the same time, for the 60% of Americans that aren't going to college, haven't gone to college, don't intend to, we need them to have a world-class post-secondary education to get a ladder into the middle class. So that creates an opportunity to do what I already did, which is help author the modernization of our nation's skills-based and vocational education system. But it turns out my law was so popular, it's oversubscribed. There's not enough money that goes into it, even though 60% of Americans depend on it. So I'm going to be pushing that like crazy. And by the way, that particular law benefits every single high school and every community college throughout Illinois, including Lincoln, the various community colleges here, the various high school districts in this area, and throughout the state.
All right, thanks, Congressman, for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much.